Well, thank you everyone for coming. My name is Kishore Jaleta. Work at in the developer division, developer services division in Microsoft. I'm an SRE lead. Run two teams, Azure DevOps and 1ES. Azure DevOps used to be called VSTS. We make tools for software engineers. 1ES is more of an internal tooling system for all of Microsoft. So all our customers are developers across Microsoft. I've been with Microsoft for about 6 months now, 5-6 months. Yep, and I'm here to talk about incident response and SRE and DevOps with Jason.
Yeah, my name is Jason Hand. I am part of the Microsoft Azure Ops or Cloud Ops advocacy team. The most important part of that term or that title is the advocacy. I'm an advocate for all of you, and I'm an advocate for all the people at Microsoft too, to try to make sure that y'all are learning all the best and the newest things that we have to offer at Azure, especially in the space of DevOps and SRE and incident management, which of course are kind of new to, sounds like Ignite. So we're really excited to be here and talking about what's going on at Microsoft in terms of how we deal with outages and sort of the SRE practices and the DevOps principles. So with that, I'm going to let Kishore kind of take it from there.
Sure. So we have a lot to cover, and if there's a chance we may actually not need the whole time, but it's probably best to leave the questions towards the end. But feel free to, if there's like any really super pressing question, feel free to interject. And
yeah, and I'll add also, we've got our Twitter handles there too. So I personally, I'd love to have deeper conversations on Twitter or any social media about what's going on. And so if there's anything that you hear or you see up on the screen today, if you're so inclined, definitely take some pictures, share it, use the hashtag of MSIgnite. If you think of some questions later that you want to reach out to either one of us, we'd definitely love to chat with you more after today.
Yep. Cool. So I think before we dive into incident response, it's important to understand what is SRE and what is DevOps. I know we've been using these terms for a long time. So maybe we'll start with DevOps first. So this is quite literally what we have up on Azure DevOps' website. I'm not going to read it, but at a high level, it's really about, DevOps is really about, I would say, breaking down the barriers between idea and execution so that you can ship stuff quickly to production and get feedback and iterate on that feedback. Right? So it's about, and also making sure that there's enough reliability of your service along the way. Right? So very high level, you're breaking down the barriers and the silos, and the teams are working together. We've been talking about DevOps for a long time, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. So that's DevOps, which is like the what part, right? In terms of SRE, to us, at least at Microsoft, it's a hybrid, production-oriented role with both systems and software engineering skills. So DevOps is the what, and SRE, to some extent, is the how. It's more prescriptive way of running your online service, right? Typically, SREs are responsible for availability, performance, monitoring, latency, all the usual stuff, scalability and efficiency. Fundamentally, SRE as a discipline is about improving things through engineering. So there is that software aspect of it. So again, we start off by saying SRE versus DevOps, but both are complementary and primarily aimed at breaking down the barriers and improving velocity while also making sure that you have the right level of reliability as to what your customers actually want. Okay. So this is a good segue into, I'll not spend too much time on this, but you probably, how many people have heard these terms or these acronyms before? Wow, that's a lot. I think there's another talk where we'll be talking about these. I think it's the intro to SRE, but this is an important concept. When I say, if you remember the slide about SRE and as a discipline, it's about, it's a very prescriptive way. So what I mean by that is you're managing your service through SLOs, or service level objectives and error budgets. That's a fundamental principle of being an SRE. We'll talk more about this at a later slide, but at a very high level, indicators are, could be, as an example, it could be availability, right, or latency of your service. An objective is how much availability do you want? So you can have 3 nines, 4 nines. We have several different services. For example, if you take Azure DevOps, there's a authentication service which has a 4-9 SLO, because obviously if you want to authenticate, if you want to log in to Azure DevOps, you need to be able to authenticate. So all the services, all the microservices depend on that service to be up all the time. Whereas a different service may have a lower SLO. And the service level agreement is what you have with your customers. So that's usually your SLO should be higher than the SLA, so that you have enough time to react. Okay? And you can also have things like error budgets. In fact, we talk about this every week during a meeting called LSR, Lifecycle Review. And each time a service goes over the SLO, which means you've exhausted your budget, we ask, by we I mean the SRE team, asking the engineering teams or the feature teams, saying, what are you going to do about it? And we have had situations where we stop feature development and work on reliability to get the SLO back under the budget. Okay.
So we thought after we sort of leveled on SLIs, SLOs, we would dive into really what we think of as the unique phases of incident response. And of course, well, first of all, how many of you are on call for different aspects of your business, your systems, your servers, everything, all that kind of, okay? How many of you are on call right now? All right. All right, well, hopefully it stays quiet for you.
Is the internet working?
So no surprise, detection is what we sort of view as the very first part of incident response. This is, of course, where you're monitoring. Hopefully you're monitoring, or something is telling you have a problem. Hopefully there's not customers taking to Twitter to tell you you have problems, but that is a thing that happens. But detection, regardless of the way you know about it, is, of course, the first step. And then, of course, once you are made aware of an issue, then you start digging in and trying to understand what's really wrong, what's breaking, how bad is it. This is part of the triaging part, is who do we get in, now that somebody knows there's a problem, maybe I was paged, but I'm not necessarily the right person. So I got to start bringing in Kishore and other people. That's the triaging. And you'll probably notice through a lot of this, especially on the next coming slides, that communication and transparency is a huge part of this. There was a time long ago, it feels like, where when something went wrong, we kind of wanted to keep that to ourselves and not necessarily broadcast, especially to our customers, that something isn't working, something's not right. But that's all changing, or actually has changed. Now customers sort of demand a lot more transparency. They understand when things break sometimes before you do. So the triaging and the communication part is very key. And you'll see some of our process about how we make sure stakeholders, not only internally but externally, are made aware of what's going on and what we're doing about it, and that kind of stuff. So that's the triaging and the communications. Next, we sort of dive in and try to understand, once we have the right people involved, what's actually going on. We dig into the logs, we dig into the different monitoring tools, we start having conversations, we start looking at maybe some business intelligence analytics. There's a lot of stuff that can kind of tip us off to what's actually going on. And there's usually multiple factors. There's not usually one sort of thing that broke. There's a lot of stuff that sort of contributes to the failures that we see. And then we're into the mitigation, where maybe we need to start taking action, running commands, kicking off some scripts, scaling some stuff, moving things around within the cloud to sort of not only mitigate things and keep them from getting worse, but also actually start improving the service and bringing stuff back up. And then one of the most important things that is almost always going to be super beneficial, but oftentimes left sort of out of the formula, is doing some sort of learning review, some sort of discussion afterwards. A lot of times these are known as postmortems. Some people still call them root cause analysis. We tend to like the term learning review because it insinuates that we need to come out of this with more than just finger pointing and maybe one thing that sort of broke that we're going to go try to fix or improve. we want to understand the broader spectrum of what happened. Not only what broke, but how did we respond? Did our detection find it, or did a customer find it? Who was the first person who was brought into this during that triage? Was that the right person? Were they given the right information? There's a lot of stuff that gets left on the floor when you don't have these discussions, these what we call just learning reviews. And so across the industry, a lot of companies are putting a lot of effort away from whether it's a large outage or something small, and even sometimes it's not necessarily a bad thing, it's a good thing, but we go in and have this really deep discussion of what can we learn and sort of continuously improve. So these learning reviews are super important, and a lot of companies are really starting to invest a lot of energy and a lot of time in building up some structure around how we do these learning reviews. In the language like postmortem and root cause analysis, we're starting to see that go away because, as you can imagine, the term postmortem kind of insinuates the search of death and to understand, what was the terrible thing that went wrong. And honestly, that's not what the point of these exercises are for. It's to get people, or really smart people, probably high-paid engineers and IT folks together and actually walk out with some really good actionable things that we're going to do to not only help maybe prevent that type of failure in the future, but also prepare our systems and make them a little bit more hardened or a little bit more resilient to these types of things in the future. Because there's always going to be problems, right? Like that's why so many of you are on call. There's just things that are just going to break. So what can we learn from each of these scenarios that helps us and helps the rest of the team and helps the organization as a whole move forward? And then we take those things and they have to have some sort of actionable takeaways, right? And then those end up going into our workflow, and we start building stories for our engineers to maybe add some more monitoring. We found out that it was customers who detected the problem, and maybe they did go to Twitter. So maybe one of the things we learned in our learning review is that we've got some blind spots in our monitoring because someone else knew about this problem before we did. So we're gonna get some action items in, and we're gonna start actually not just repairing things, but building and engineering things into the system so that this response to problems is now shortened. Maybe this type of problem that we saw yesterday was a 15-minute outage. There's no reason to assume that this exact thing would happen again in the future, but something very much like it may. And if we can turn that 15-minute outage into, let's say, a 10-minute outage, then we're moving the needle in the right direction. And we want to continue to do that. That's all part of the continuous improvement and continuous learning conversation. So these are the sort of the phases that we think of in terms of incident response. And there's a lot you can sort of learn from these things, and I think that's sort of the big takeaway is there's so many things going on. Systems are very complex, and learning should be a very big focus on that.
Cool. Yeah. So we'll spend most of the session going over. I'll be giving you. I try to come up with examples and tools that I can give you guys to just give you a better understanding of both in terms of the process and the tools we use internally to be able to effectively mitigate an incident while managing communications, customer communications along the way. So first step, detection, right? Obviously, you have production, it's running, you have your code, infrastructure, everything else, and the primary way of knowing that something is wrong is through monitoring and alerting. So make sure that you have proper monitoring and alerting in place, which is alerting the right people who actually have the highest probability of fixing the problem. So try not to have too many layers in between. Just so you know, in our case, there are alerts which go directly to the engineering teams. So it bypasses even the SRE team. But for alerts which are more at the platform, infrastructure, frameworks level, those alerts go to the SRE team. So we'll talk about that more in a later slide, but it's a joint responsibility. So make sure that availability is again a joint responsibility, or reliability for that matter. And the goal is to find issues faster than your customer. We don't always do it, but again, going back to what Jason said, if you have had an outage, focus on the lessons learned, focus on what you can do better next time so that you can hopefully detect the issue before your customer. Speaking of which, can you show by raise of hands who, people have been on call, so at your places or your companies, do you detect issues before your customers do, or is it the other way around? Anyone consistently do it? Wow, cool. What's the secret? Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. We have a similar tool. I'll be talking about something called Kusto. It's an internal tool, but it's pretty similar to what you just about Splunk. By the way, people who didn't hear, he talked about Splunk. Okay, so that's detection. We'll spend a few minutes on this. So we have something called, I think the team Azure DevOps and even 1ES to some extent, we went through several different iterations of this model, what we call as a command model, CIA command model. CIA stands for Customer Impact Assessment. So this alert, it's a catch-all alert. So it's a very high-level alert showing exactly the customers who were impacted with a high degree of precision. I'll explain how this works, but this is, again, not system-level alert, not infrastructure-level alert. Once this alert triggers, someone in some account is actually being impacted continuously. So the way it works is the math is over a 5-minute window, we measure the number of users based on continuous impact of that 5. Continuous impact is defined as, during that 5 minutes, it's like 2 or more intervals, like 2 or more 1-minute intervals, where there was more than 50 users who were impacted, right? And the alert itself is based on 3 such 5-minute windows. Did all of that make sense? Great, someone nodded their head, thank you. I don't have to use the next slide. But again, this, we constantly keep changing this, but the high level is to try to strike a balance between waking someone up in the middle of the night just because one user was impacted out of millions. Maybe that user refreshed their browser and things worked, in which case the issue was transient, in which case we don't want to wake someone up. So this gives you sort of, it's more illustrative. Again, there's 2 windows, but I just imagine if there were 3. But if you look at the last scenario, where again, 2 impact minutes in a 5-minute window, and there's another one, continuous impact during the second one, which means that there's continuous impact and there's something going on. And each red one means there's at least 50 users who had either slow command. The command could be, let's say you click on your boards and or your work items, and then that command was either slow or it just failed. And there's definitions on what slow means, and that's, you can actually configure that. Any questions on this? Wow, that's amazing.
Told you, it's perfect.
All right, cool. And then
well, I had something I wanted to add here, right? One of the things, we don't want to gloss over this because I'm hoping some of you are thinking a customer impacted thing. That's kind of an interesting way to sort of go about this, although we've already said, like, we don't want the customers to know about the problem before we do. One of the things that's sort of changing within our industry when it comes to monitoring, especially, and I think we had this discussion before our talk, I think a big contributing factor to that is sort of the transition into the cloud, is that we're starting to care a little bit less and less about the actual physical infrastructure, about the underlying stuff that, quite honestly, now that it's in the cloud, we can scale it, or we can move on to another node or another instance. We can sort of just not really care if there's this one instance that isn't working right. We don't need to spend hours digging into why. We can just spin up another one and move on. And then we'll do our learning review later and see if we can take some, get some information out of that. But why should we spend a lot of time triaging and dealing with something that we really don't need, right? And so because of that, that's really allowed us to sort of pivot and spend a little bit less time focusing on the actual underlying things that we used to monitor. And now we can focus on what is the experience like for the customer. Because quite honestly, I might have all of my CPUs just pegged at 100%, but everything still is fine for the customer. And I don't want someone to be woken up in the middle of the night necessarily just because everything looks kind of wacky, if actually the customers are doing what they need to. They're getting the value that they need. And then on the reverse of that too, maybe across all of our dashboards and everything that we monitor, everything that we think is really important, it's all green lights, everything's good. But there's a blind spot. There's something that we aren't looking at. And we have customers all around the world who are experiencing a problem and we are not aware of it at all. So that's sort of the transition and just sort of the philosophy and the theory about monitoring these days, is that we want to make it so that we focus on what the customer's experiencing. And that could be, external customers, it might be someone within our own company, but we have to start paying attention to what they're actually experiencing rather than so much of our energy on the lower level stuff. So I just wanted to add that a little bit because we kind of gloss over a little bit, I think, in some of these conversations about this customer impact stuff, when it really is a pretty substantial shift in thinking.
Yep. I think you had a question, sir.
The question.
We do both. I mean, I can talk more about it, but essentially it's telemetry. So you have systems. It's actually part of the framework. So each time a command, someone clicks on something on the server side, the framework emits a log, which is logged onto our Kusto cluster, which is where we are it's sort of like Splunk, and then we query based on that. It's actually quite literally from the framework. It's built into the framework. Correct. So that's one level. We also have what the end users are experiencing. So we have some synthetic monitoring around it, and we take that into account when we calculate the availability. So it's a combination of the both. But what I just told you, the CIA model is once the bits get into our network, into the framework. Okay. We've been extending, based on the success of the CIA model, we've actually extended the model to orchestration frameworks. An orchestration framework is, for example, you kick off a build, right? So it's a pretty complex set of things have to happen in the background asynchronously for that build to succeed. For example, once the build is successful, you normally publish it to an artifact service. So that step has to be successful. All the tests have to run, and you may be making so many calls in the interim. And we don't have a sophisticated model for that yet, but that's changing, and we should be shipping that out soon. Again, it really is based on an end-to-end ID, just like the CIA model, where you have a, it sort of is like distributed tracing, where that ID is passing through different systems, and it's different touch points, and we log all those into our Kusto cluster, and then we can query it and then alert based on that. We also take a similar approach for calculating availability and uptime, where, again, the math is simple. The number of users, the number of user impact minutes on the total impact minutes during a window, the total minutes during a window minus the impacted minutes divided by the total minutes during a window gives you at a high level, the way uptime is calculated. There's an amazing blog post put up by our previous VP, Brian Harry. You should go and check it out. Talks in detail about how we calculate availability and uptime. Cool. So that's how you detect it. Now, once you've detected something, as Jason was mentioning, one of the first things you have to be doing is do some initial triage, try to reproduce the error real quick. The on-call should do that. And then send out the communication, because communications is such an important aspect of when you're managing an incident. Just to give you an example, my flight got canceled about 2 days ago. I'm not going to tell you who the airline is, but the experience was, flight getting canceled is one thing, but the experience of just managing the customers and the communications, and it was horrible. Similarly, if you're dealing with an incident, make sure that all your customers are, in the loop. They're being actively communicated what the latest status is. And that stuff really, really, really matters. In fact, I'll be talking about a recent outage we had with Azure. All of you probably heard about the recent massive outage we had about September 4th, if I'm not wrong. Can't forget that date. We've been talking openly about it. Our head of engineering posted a blog, put up a blog post on it. You should check it out. It's really, really good, exhaustive. We talk about all the repair items we are trying to come up with to make sure that that never, ever happens again, because that's probably one of our biggest outages ever. And we've dealt with a lot of unhappy customers. But again, we were able to, again, the comms were so important. I'm not saying we did it perfectly, but again, there's always room for improvement, but the comms part. So this again talks about high level, send out the initial comms. ICM is an internal tool within Microsoft where we manage the incident. So all the information about an incident, the incident itself is automatically created, is in that tool. So the whole company knows where to go to find that information. The same thing with comms, post to Twitter, we post to our blog, we post to Skype, we use Skype/Teams for the internal communication, so spin up a bridge, all the good stuff. We also have a status page, so if you're running a service, make sure that there's some sort of a status page where people can go, and Azure has something similar. In fact, this is not live yet. It should go live in about a month. We have something similar today, but this is much more resilient to outages. So I'm not sure how many of you were impacted from the Azure's outage, but there were times where you're trying to go and check the status page, and status page itself wasn't working, which can be very frustrating, and we get it. So we want to, at least the status page, to be resilient to the underlying failures in the infrastructure. Again, this gives you a pretty high-level breakdown. So all these are on the left. Azure DevOps offers all these services and across different regions, and where there is impact. In the future, we will be extending this to the account level, so that if your account, even if a single customer is impacted, that person should be able to log in and understand if his or her account was impacted. All right. So that's from the phases. We talked about detection, we talked about communication, and then comes the troubleshooting. Again, this goes back to what Jason talked about, the mitigation part. Always we have a mitigate first mindset. So rather than trying to root cause things initially, you're trying to mitigate it so that your customers are not, there's less impact. So in terms of troubleshooting and insights, so obviously now you've detected it, you've communicated it, you also need to be able to, again, try to reproduce the error, look for customer impact, look for things that changed, also narrow down the changes to specific set of scale units or by region, and hopefully you can also narrow it down to some component or layer in your stack. There's a really good tool we have, which we use to troubleshoot. That's production issue. It's called Kusto internally, but it's called Azure Log Analytics. It's pretty similar to Splunk, but real time, you can query it to get almost near real-time information from production, which is the telemetry part, and query it. And it's a much, much better alternative to having dashboards, which are static. If you remember back in the day, at least when I was doing sort of SRE kind of work back in the day, everything was dashboards. So if something happened, you click through about 200,000 dashboards, not 200,000, but some large number of dashboards. But in this case, it's the opposite. All the data is there, and then all you have to do is, if you understand the query language, which I'll show you in a second, you can query it to know exactly what is going on, which user was impacted, which region, which scale unit. All that information is available. So this is a example query where, remember, 9.4, which is the Azure outage. We're trying to see what were the slow or failed commands between that time periods for an account. Account could be, there could be one company, right? And you join that by activity ID, which is again the telemetry which is going in from your, from your account and from your browser. And then you can also draw graphs along the way. So this list gives you the list of commands that failed, or the list command again is the list of things that you do when you're trying to browse Azure DevOps or VSTS. So it is that powerful. And data from production, again, is there in Kusto in almost near real time. So if you don't have anything like this, highly, highly recommended. People are calling it observability these days, but highly recommended. Okay.
Can I add something real quick too? And just in terms of the term observability, because that is kind of becoming one of the newer buzzwords. Really what it means is understanding the reality of your system. And a lot of that information is in your logs. It's in lots of different places, right? But really trying to dig in and understand what's really, really going on. Because we have a lot of ideas about what's happening in our system. Our monitoring is telling us certain things. Yep. But the truth is in there. We just have to go sort of find it. So this idea of observability and creating observable systems sort of opens up the door to all of those improvements that we didn't really know needed to be done in the first place. And so that's sort of the push into this whole observability thing, is that we really want to understand the reality of the system. Not what we think is going on, not even what our existing monitoring is telling us, but there's a lot more to the story. So I just kind of want to interject with that, because that's a term that gets thrown around, and we internally, of course, use Kusto or Azure Log Analytics to sort of provide more, quote, observability into our systems.
Sure. How many people have heard about the term observability? I'm just curious. Interesting. Cool. Yeah, I was, last year I was speaking at a conference in New York, and apparently this started off in the Valley, and then now it's like catching on. So, sorry, go ahead. Correct. It is. Yep. In fact, there's a concept called, I think there's a field called end-to-end ID. So as a request traverses through different systems, every touch point is logged in Kusto, and we are actually able to query based on that. So we can recreate a call trace or a request trace based on that end-to-end ID. It's really, really powerful tool. And the best part is Kusto is just, it's highly scalable. It just works. You don't have to, it's amazing. All right. So now we've done some initial, troubleshooting. So either at this point, again, if you have the mitigate first mindset, I think it's important to have that. Focus on that first, and different steps for doing that. Pretty standard. There's nothing like overly complex here. You have your own ways of, I'm sure, mitigating an incident. Could be rollback, failover, restart, out of rotation, turn on your circuit breakers, or turn off a feature flag. There's so many different things you can be, or restart a service if need be. All right, so you've mitigated the incident. Now what? The next step, and Jason talked about it, it's probably, it's an important step, is to learn, right? Make sure that you're learning from your incident. Make sure that the postmortems are blameless. In fact, we, in Azure DevOps and also 1ES, we have something called a lifesite review, which happens every week, where teams come in and talk about, the lessons learned. The focus of that meeting is mostly on org-wide learnings, because there's a bunch of people in that meeting. The internal postmortems within the service level happen before that meeting, so teams conduct their own postmortems, come up with lessons learned. But the LSR that happens, is mostly around like the org-wide learnings. In fact, we start off by, and there's also guidance, there's also presenter guidance on what exactly you should be talking, so that people just don't come in and talk about their favorite thing. They're focusing on what can be useful for the whole audience. And just, like stuff like that doesn't happen overnight. The culture is key to get to a point, because I have worked at companies where it's hard for anyone to be in the postmortem other than the SRE or the ops teams or the IT ops team, or whatever you want to call them. But in Microsoft, you won't believe there have been situations where the SRE team canceled a lifesite review a week because there were not enough postmortem to talk about, and the engineering teams come back and say, "Why did you guys cancel this? We just loved this meeting." So that's amazing. So there's one less thing to worry about, but it doesn't happen overnight. You have to make sure that you have to keep at it. You have to show people that there's actually value in doing these lessons learned. We also do public postmortems for every SEB 1 and SEB 0, for example. Azure outage was a SEB 1, so we did that, and we hold ourselves accountable for that. Not every company does it, but we totally believe in transparency. In fact, if you look at that blog post, we talk about a lot of things like lossless failovers and asynchronous replication. There's some really good stuff in there which helps you understand why we had a lightning struck a data center and that caused a massive outage. But I urge you to go and read that blog. It's amazing. People spend a lot of time on it in writing it. Again, the transparency is key. We almost like, in fact, our head of engineering admitted that we sort of failed the customers, but here's what we're doing to make sure that this never happens again.
And I wanted to add just a little bit more to this, because learning reviews are something I've been really passionate about and have talked about for quite a number of years, actually. I'm fairly new at Microsoft, and previously I was at a company called VictorOps, which is now part of Splunk. And they're incident response and sort of a SaaS for letting people know that there's some sort of problem. But they've also got some tooling in there to really help you understand what was going wrong. Originally it was called a postmortem report. I sort of helped champion changing that name for the reasons we talked about at the beginning. I just don't think that's a great term. But some of the things that we like to coach people in terms of how do you do these sort of learning reviews. First of all, how many of you have some sort of structure around an exercise like this, where you do this and you have like a way that you do it? Okay. So one of the things that I'll tell you several things. First of all, when we did these, and I haven't been a part of one yet here at Microsoft, but when we did them, we always had one person who was sort of the facilitator of the discussion. And we always made sure that they set the stage and they set the tone very early on in the conversation that, just like Kishore said, we're not here to blame. There's no finger pointing. No one's in trouble. Nobody did anything wrong. In fact, we want to celebrate that person if they maybe even feel a little bit down on themselves because they're the person who ran the command or clicked the button or whatever that took out an entire data center. The fact is that could have happened no matter what. It was going to happen no matter what. Anybody could have done it. So there's really no reason to sort of put some sort of blame or shame or anything like that. We just want to get to the bottom of what really happened. It goes back to the observability thing. Let's understand the reality. And some of that is actually what's going on in people's heads when they make decisions about the things that they're going to do to mitigate or the things that they're going to do to repair. They have some sort of cognitive process in that. And we can't be in everyone's head, so it's important to let that sort of evolve in the conversation of these learning reviews. And a lot of that will happen as you start to build out in a discussion really the shape of an incident. We talked about the different phases. Well, within sort of the early part of the mitigation and the triaging, there is the response and the remediation and all that. Well, if you can sort of chop that down into smaller times, like maybe we talked about a 15-minute outage, if we can turn that into 10, we start to actually improve our systems over time. And the only way we can sort of shorten each of those phases within an incident is to actually understand them in isolation and say, hey, this was the triaging part of the incident, and it took us 20 minutes just to get through this phase. Is that something we can improve on? And so as you start to talk about the timeline, our defection caught this at let's say 8:09 p.m., and then the first engineer was made aware of the problem at 30 seconds later. Well, that's a pretty good metric. That's a pretty good time. But maybe the next part of the incident took a little bit longer. And so we start to talk about the entire timeline, including what were people thinking, and not in a judgmental way, but like I want to understand why you thought that Azure Analytics, Log Analytics was the first place to go. And then we can sort of all, Kishore can jump in and say, well, that's not wrong, but I would have gone over here. And then we can discuss that as a team and figure out what was really the better way or the best way to go about this in this kind of situation. And that's really one of the best things that you can get out of these learning reviews is that there's so much stuck in our heads that we honestly just kind of get busy and just don't really have an incentive to share. But when we do, we have this knowledge transfer. That means like I don't have to be the one who has to deal with this problem next time because now everybody has a general sense of what you're supposed to do under this scenario. And so you're probably getting a sense that these are super important, I think, at least in my opinion. And I think a lot of the companies that have really adopted some sort of structure, and that's why I asked, are seeing some huge results in their availability and in their uptime and in how many nines they're aiming for and their error budgets, because they are putting a strong stress on learning in a very safe environment where we get really the cognitive process out for discussion. Not just what broke, physically, not just what technology isn't working or wasn't working, but what were people thinking? And again, a very not judgy way, just like we want to understand what you were doing, why, and see if we can improve on that.
Yep, cool. All right, and then the final thing is, once you do the postmortem, make sure that you are taking the repair items seriously. I would recommend you have some sort of SLAs around how soon you can get them done. The SLAs here, we align with Azure. But normally, some of these are done way sooner than the published SLAs. But it's important to have SLAs for these repair items so that you can hold people accountable and actually get to a better state and then close the loop on it. Yep, and that closes the incident response. One thing though is this is the first time, if I'm not wrong, that there's SRE sessions at Ignite. There's more, so we're really excited, and we would also love feedback from you, all of you, please, and on how the session went, so that we can improve things for next year. But really, really excited to bring SRE content, and there's more sessions. And please, if you are interested, you can doing a deep dive into any of the SLIs part, anything else for that matter. Feel free to
Yeah, we're really excited to be able to talk about this SRE and reliability and resiliency engineering, observability and DevOps and all the things that are really kind of forward thinking in our industry right now, and we're excited to be part of that and share what we're doing and how you all can sort of learn from us and improve. And like he mentioned, we've got several other breakout sessions. There was a really great one this morning from David. There's still some more coming up. I suggest you check those out. But otherwise, we told you we'd probably give you some time back. Maybe you can get some lunch a little bit early. But if you've got questions, we'll definitely hang out. You can come up to the microphone. We can answer those. Or we'll probably hang out for a little bit afterwards, too. Maybe out in the hallway if you want to chat out there.
Sure. If people have questions now, there's the microphone.
Does anybody have any questions? You want to raise your hand? Yeah, why don't you come up here so we don't have to repeat the questions. Let's try to repeat that or summarize it a little.
Sure. So if I understand correctly, you're saying, does it make sense to have SLAs if you have work in a place where there's vendors and each of them have SLAs, or? Yeah. So a vendor will have an SLA for response to their product. Right. And if they don't meet it by X amount of time, does that discourage some? No, I think in fact it's a good thing. It's almost pretty analogous to having APIs talking. If you're a team A and team B, ideally you'll be talking with each other using an API, and the API has like a timeout and there's an SLA, right? So, and if I don't get a response back from A, I don't get a response from B within 250 milliseconds, I try to do something else. So that becomes your SLO or the SLA. So regardless, the reason, taking a step back, the reason we even have SLOs is to have some sort of a shared ownership model where, for example, if I'm an SRE team and you're an engineering team, you probably mostly care about shipping features to your customers, generally speaking, not that you don't care about availability. I, being an SRE, care more about reliability and availability. So where do we, I can lock everything down and just close, no changes, and then we have 100% uptime. That's not going to work. That's not realistic. You, again, the same thing. You're just shipping, don't care about reliability. That's also not good. So I think that's where the SLOs come in and say, you know what, let's just sit down and say, here's your target and here's a budget. As long as you're within this budget, as long as you're within 99.9 as an example, then you're okay. You can ship. But the moment you go over, we agreed that you'll spend more time doing reliability work to bring you back to. So in your case, so that's like the principle behind SLO is to have that sort of self-regulating mechanism where you can hold each other accountable. So in your case, it may be applicable to. Sure. And I found that the vendors, when you would have a threshold below
go in and have an exemption, and they would explain out why something went wrong and what they did to remediate it. So I see sometimes that being beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, as long as there's incentives, I mean, people are going to, do things. But again, it's to hopefully you can align some of those incentives where things can work.
And a lot of these new concepts, and doesn't sound like necessarily new to you, but a lot of this is really forcing companies to rethink SLAs, especially the ones that they may have with other vendors or other customers or whatever. In fact, I haven't checked lately, but for a long time, GitHub didn't even publish an SLA on their website. And there's a lot of companies that were that way. And the reason is, if you're going to hold me accountable to this, I can't innovate. I can't be agile. I can't put out new products if you're holding me to this handcuffed SLA. And that's not good business. So really rethinking what we have in place in terms of SLAs has become a very big conversation for a lot of folks. Yeah. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I'm not quite sure, how. I mean, what you just talked about is more like experimentation and A/B testing, where, or you have an MVP, you ship it out to a few customers, and we do show it to a few. It could be internal customers. We have 50,000 developers, and then get feedback on those features, and then ship it out slowly, gradually over a period of time. But it does take time. It really depends on what we are trying to do. For example, recently we shipped a new revision to Azure DevOps, so the UI has changed. That's taken a few months to gradually release to a point where you're not sort of, impacting the existing customers, right? So the standard, A/B experimentation, you're looking at data in that experiment and then trying to gradually roll it out.
Sure. I don't think any of those are on.
Infrastructure and your tolerances and the things that matter, and how your applications are instrumented, how your environments are instrumented. So it's not so much that we can ship a bunch of use case that the SES team has, or teams have. The foundational capabilities to build on are all just there. They're available. So, if you want to go, and there's a session on Thursday on building SLIs and SLOs in Azure that David will be doing, and just kind of start talking about how you go about it. It's more the pattern of how we go about building them than waiting for Microsoft to ship another new feature with a bunch of SLIs and SLOs in the box, right? Because it really does depend on the thing you're running and how you've instrumented your application and environment.
Okay.
Yep.
A little bit about this staffing. We're getting started. We're thinking about how we hire SRE
Well, that's an interesting question. I think the whole industry is sort of struggling with that. I've been struggling with this for a long time because there's no courses in university which teaches you SRE kind of stuff. In fact, Jared, who's on my team, is going to talk about some of this in his talk on Thursday. But the short answer is the thing that's worked out the most, if you remember, I told SRE is a hybrid discipline, systems and software. You can't have either. You can be a good software engineer, but if you don't have the systems experience, it's hard for you to have an end-to-end understanding of how like a bit flows from your browser to all the way to production. So based on my experience, and I think it's easier to hire software engineers or people with a software engineering background and then train them on the system skills to be SREs. Now, there's also good IT ops and systems engineers who can be trained to be SREs, but teach them, train them on how to code and things like that.
And I'll also add, I actually wrote a book on SRE earlier this year when I was still at VictorOps, and the point of putting that book out really is because we were getting a lot of questions about this stuff, and the answer is always it depends. Every company does it just a little bit different, and we were a startup of about 100 and so people, and so for us, our approach was quite different than what we would do here at Microsoft, and probably how you would do it yourself, but we wanted to make sure that the SRE just sort of ideas and concepts was really blanketed across the entire company, starting from the CEO all the way down to the newest hire. And the reason for that is that we want reliability and resiliency to really be top of mind for everyone. Everybody, from the CEOs down, they've got different dashboards that they're looking at, different business analytics, and they have to sort of have this mindset too. They want to ship out features as quickly as possible, but they also understand that an outage can be very detrimental to the business. And so it's a matter of balancing those two things. We were a SaaS, so we had certain types of concerns. Other, depending on your responsibilities in your company, you're going to have different concerns too. But we mentioned it several times in here that it really is sort of a cultural change, just like you hear a lot with DevOps. It's just culture, and that's true because it's really about sort of changing how we view what it is we're building and the value that it gives the end user or that customer. As an engineer, I have certain ideas about what that may be, but as a product owner, they have different ideas about what that may be. They may be concerned, let's say I'm in product, I might be more concerned that we just went from about 50,000 people in our system to 200. And if engineering didn't think to put some monitoring around that, then I'm not made aware of it, and we may be going for hours with a real problem that we just had no idea. So I think the answer is, of course it depends, but I think it's both. It's a little bit of everything. I think everyone should be aware of these principles and why we're doing it, and then sort of begin to sort of coach, what is it you want, what keeps you up at night about your system, about your service? And if you ask 12 people, you'll get 12 different answers. And you should address each one of those because they're all related to the availability and the reliability of your service. Yep.
Going back to tools, I'm a big advocate of log analytics in our company. What made you all decide to go with Kusto? I know it's not GA for general public, but go with the Kusto cluster versus log analytics, which is obviously Kusto with walls. What was the driving decision behind that?
I don't know the answer. I've not been at Microsoft, but someone can help me out. But to me, Kusto is cool, and it just gives you, it just works, and it just scales so well. But maybe someone else may have an answer. Do you know why?
I know a bit why. Kusto, for us, one, it scales, but it can take input from so many different systems, and it's built into a lot of our monitoring tools and monitoring clients, where the information just flows directly into Kusto. We have both what we call warm path and hot path monitoring. And hot path monitoring system dumps into Kusto as well. So we can go into Kusto 5 minutes after something alerts, and we can have all this detailed information. Like Kishore was saying, we can actually on the Azure DevOps side know exactly who clicked what buttons to get there. I'm in the 1ES side, I can see exact builds that fail.
So going back to that, though, the idea of we want to get there, that's where we want to be. So what do we know on a GA for the Kusto cluster tool?
The log analytics is there. I think it's
That's there, but then there's the whole let's open the
I think you should work with, I don't know, whoever you're in touch with at Microsoft to see if you can add those features to Azure Log Analytics and see if they can. I'm sure there's a reason why it's not GA yet, but obviously I would imagine before putting it out for public, you don't want to make sure that it's like solid, reliable, and backed up by SLA and things like that. Right? I'm sure we'll get there. I mean, obviously, probably it's a matter of time.
Yeah, and if you struggle to find someone to give that feedback to or to have that conversation, then reach out to us.
Yeah, reach out to
Twitter.
us.
Or
happy to connect with anyone.
So one other thing around this, so part of this whole thing is also includes App Insights, and all of that stuff is now just Azure Monitor as of like this, right? And so you write your Kusto queries against all of the Azure Monitor related stuff. So a lot of that stuff it is there. We're kind of disparate before, and they've kind of been brought together under one team.
Yep.
Well, I think that the DevOps sort of you mentioned, at least in Microsoft, there's no DevOps team per se. There's an SRE team and there's a feature team. So there's no DevOps team. But going back to your question about what's the right time, I would say, generally speaking, we actually talked about this a lot internally, and you don't have to be at a certain scale to implement SRE principles. But you can always start small, start with a team and have them be the SRE team and have that team embed into the engineering teams and see if that's adding any value. Again, managed by SLOs, automation, like the principles are the same, and see if that's bringing value, and then slowly roll it out to a larger organization. But again, focusing on,
I'd like to add.
sure.
So we had a lot of, they didn't create our SDC role, which is very much like the SRE role, until there were a lot of SLAs that were getting dropped, and people were just pointing fingers and couldn't figure out who or what was actually causing it. And they're like, okay, we need some people to actually go down and figure out what's going on, and they're agnostic. They don't care about individual teams or alliances. They're their own.
Yeah, I think the answer is an enthusiastic yes. Like all of this stuff that we talk about, it's not bolted on afterwards. It's not just in production. These are things, this is part of the engineering effort now, is that we have to get more telemetry into the system to give us that observability. And we want to see that in our pre-production environments. I want to see it in development because, quite honestly, this is going to be used by someone, probably me, in production later. And so, one, I want to make sure that everything is plumbed up and it's giving me the insight that I'm going to maybe need or probably will need at some point. So the tooling is built in from day one. The knowledge of what that tooling is supposed to tell you is built in from day one. Practice around how to use that tooling is all built in from day one. It's the same thing with security. For many years, we didn't even bring monitoring and security conversations in until we were ready to push to production. Yeah. And that doesn't work anymore because then you get it into production and the people that are probably going to respond to it don't know how to use it. And so all of this is a big kind of push as part of the DevOps conversation is that we're squishing these teams and the ideas and the incentives all together so that we think about this stuff from the very beginning rather than trying to just make it all happen in production. So it's an opinion, but my opinion is that, all of the stuff is not really, it's not for production only. It's what we're building, and it starts with early design, and then it'll eventually get into production. But everything we're saying is just engineering in general, not necessarily just production.
Got it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So what's SRE's role in the learning review? Do they just facilitate the discussion, or do they own some of the action items that come, or the repair items that come, out of the learning review?
Yeah, of course. I mean, obviously, the facilitation part is there. But if you remember, the SRE team generally is responsible for anything that's not directly code related. So if it's a platform issue, or if it's a networking issue, or if it's an infrastructure issue, or storage, Azure storage. So we take an active part in coming up with those. Again, trying to implement engineering solutions as opposed to operational solutions. Yeah, so it's a dual role. So there's both involvement.
Sure. So is there a dedicated operations team yet, or the SREs are the ones who take care of operations and or it's evaluated?
Yeah. So there's a thing called toil, right? We have heard about it, and right now, the goal is to keep it under 50%. The toil is again repetitive ops work. So we're not there yet, but we hope to get there. But the SRE team does handle the ops part.
They do.
Yep.
Yeah, and in terms of the learning review, I mean, there's really no hard rules. I think you always want the people, the individuals that were involved in the triaging and the sort of the escalation and just involved with an incident in general. You want them to be part of that because they have some insight and some knowledge about what took place. So there's, other than I would say that the one person or people that you sometimes want to keep out of these things are maybe management, because they tend to come in and want like one nectaring, and that's not the point of these. So they'll derail a good learning review really quickly. But in general, you invite anyone that you think might be able to provide insight into different aspects of what happened, even if they weren't directly involved. Maybe I just happen to be like not on call that day, but I'm senior enough that I should be involved with that learning review because I would like to hear what people were doing, what were they thinking, and then be a part of that conversation. So there's, you really want to invite as many people as you can without it getting, too large where you can't really have a good discussion.
I was thinking about is involving business after this session, because that's one piece that we are missing at this point. We're involving the incident response team, the operations team, the development team, and all of those, but we're not involving the business.
I think business would be interesting.
Yeah, I don't know how.
To have. I mean, hopefully conversations are happening, even outside the learning review or the LSR. But it's interesting. I mean, people are. That's an expensive meeting, and sometimes it's good to have people, and maybe sometimes too many is also not.
And that's a big reason why we really try to push this language shift away from the idea of postmortem or root cause analysis, because that insinuates we only get sort of the technical people involved. And this is a learning review. So we want as many people to know more about what's happened and what should be happening. So a lot of times I know company Chef, for many years, I don't know if they still do, but they would live stream their learning reviews because they want their customers to see that they really do take this seriously. And at VictorOps, we were the same. We didn't live stream it, but it was an open invite. We put it on the calendar, and everyone was encouraged to come because they should know what's going on with our system, and maybe provide some suggestions that we didn't think of because we're a little too close to the problem. Yep.
Yeah, of course.
Anybody else?
Give developers full access to everything, or do you maintain the deployments? How is it working at Microsoft? Want to get an idea?
Yeah, so I think the first question is, it is fairly distributed. So Azure has its own SRE team. Like the developer services, we have our own SRE team. Xbox, I think, has their own SRE team. In terms of the second question was around the access, right? So there are situations where I think most developers have most of the access, but not everything. There are things like light rail, right? Or things that if there's a backdoor, let's say your pipeline is not working, there's a backdoor there's a production issue, and you want to run a command to mitigate something, and normally it's the SRE team doing it, just because not that we don't trust the development team, the team does it on a fairly regular basis. It makes sense that they are the experts and they understand production sort of better than the feature team. But it's a shared, even the same goes for code base. I mean, we can read feature team's code base, we can make check-ins. In fact, we're just building a new service, SRE team, and it's pretty exciting.
So the thing is, my frustration is
Yeah, the deployment, the SRE team, sorry,
Oh, go ahead.
doesn't do the deployments. There's a separate, actually it's the dev teams which do the deployment.
In the dev organization,
Yep.
it's the developers that are in charge of the deployments.
And that's why you only jump in if something breaks or something.
They handle their, if they break it, they have to go fix it too. They engage with us, but if they break it, they fix it.
If it's a platform, let's say Azure networking is down, then we jump in because I'm a developer and don't necessarily understand what's going on at network. But it's again, the DevOps part is big, which is if you sort of wrote it, you own it.
Yeah, you can kind of get into that situation where you can do that when you don't need to have like release windows at 12 or 1 or whatever you said that your releases are. You should hopefully one day be able to release whenever the product team says we're ready to go. We've done all our canary tests. We've done, sort of like tested loads on different things, and yeah, let's just release at any point. And we have confidence that one, it's going to deploy because we've showed you some of the methods that we sort of look at the customer impact and the configuration, deployment, that kind of stuff. But we have not only confidence in our deployment process, but we have confidence in our monitoring, that if it gets into production, that monitoring is going to tell us before hopefully somebody else does. We have confidence in our metrics, like our log analytics, that if we detect a problem, we can probably triage and mitigate really quickly. Point I'm trying to make is that we have confidence in knowing that something went wrong and fixing it super fast. So we prefer to roll forward than roll back. But if you've got release windows that you're kind of like handcuffed to, then you actually have a different problem to probably solve for. And then you can kind of get to the stuff that we're talking.
I wanted to offer a Microsoft answer, which is, it is very difficult to speak about what is Microsoft doing as a whole because different teams approach things, different business units approach things based on their needs. And so, for example, when you hear some of what we're talking about here, this is one of the case studies for one of the parts of Microsoft. It's like saying, what is the U.S. doing about something? That's often a very hard question to answer because it's a lot of it depends. So I think you're going to hear Microsoft speaking more and more about what it does internally, and the way you're probably going to hear it is it's going to sound like we do a diverse number of things. Pick the things that make sense for you. Like nobody should try to carve code Microsoft, not even Microsoft can carve code Microsoft because it doesn't do one thing. So that's just a useful thing to know as you think about this is that some groups, like the one at Short Runs, their maturity is really good, and so as a result, they can do certain things. Their operational maturity is really they can do certain things that say a group that is spinning up that does not have the same operational maturity yet where to get to. So I always want people to think about it from where are they and where do they want to be. This is a superbly good model because of how great the work they do is. There are places in Microsoft where they're not that far advanced. And I think that's fair for us to admit it because we look like the rest of the world too.
Yes, a lot. Everyone's on call.